The night was supposed to be a celebration. The city skyline glittered like diamonds under the velvet night, and a sleek black limousine rolled out of the Grand Hotel. Inside, Isabella Carter, one of the richest and most powerful CEOs in the country, leaned back against the leather seat, her hand gently resting on her stomach. She was pregnant, glowing with the kind of happiness money could never buy. For years she had built an empire, a fortress of success, but what she wanted most was a family. Tonight she believed she had it all, but outside that tinted glass, her world was already unraveling. As the limousine glided through the empty streets, Isabella's thoughts drifted to her husband, Richard. He was supposed to join her after the gala. He had whispered sweet promises, brushed his lips against her cheek, and told her he loved her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that his love was real, that he cherished not just her power and wealth, but the woman she truly was. Then came the smell. At first it was faint, a sharp tang of gasoline that didn't belong in a luxury car. Isabella frowned, shifting in her seat. "Driver," she called out, but the divider was up. No answer. The engine roared louder, the car accelerating when it should have slowed. And then, boom! A sudden explosion shook the limousine, flames bursting from the hood, licking the sides of the car like hungry beasts. Smoke poured into the cabin, thick and suffocating. Isabella coughed violently, panic clawing up her throat. She tried the doors, they wouldn't budge. She slammed her fists against the glass, screaming for help, but the city street was empty. Inside that inferno, the CEO who had everything was reduced to a terrified woman, trapped, clutching the life inside her belly, begging for a miracle. Her mind raced back to every cold decision she had ever made, every loyal employee she had fired without a second thought. One face stood out: David Miller, a hard-working manager she had dismissed just weeks ago. He had walked out of her office with his little daughter's picture clutched in his hand, his eyes full of quiet pain. She had never thought of him again, until now. The fire grew hotter, blistering her skin, her vision blurred. She screamed, pounding the glass with every ounce of strength left in her. "Please! Someone, help me!" And then, through the haze of smoke, she saw a shadow. A man running, his coat discarded, his face determined. The car door rattled as strong hands pulled at it, kicked at it, fought against the flames. Her eyes widened as the smoke cleared just enough for her to recognize him. David. The man she had cast aside. The man with nothing left to lose. And now, he was the only thing standing between her and certain death. Before the fire, before the betrayal, Isabella Carter was a name that demanded respect. In the glittering world of business, she wasn't just a participant. She was a queen. Born into an ordinary family with no wealth, she clawed her way up through grit, discipline, and an iron will that never bent. By the age of 30, she had already built one of the largest real estate and investment empires in the country. She was the kind of woman who walked into a boardroom and made seasoned men twice her age fall silent. Her employees described her as cold, calculating, and impossible to please. They weren't wrong. She demanded perfection, and she didn't hesitate to cut off anyone who failed her standards. To Isabella, loyalty wasn't something you gave, it was something you proved. Her world was built on contracts, numbers, and results. But behind the power suits, the designer heels, and the icy eyes that intimidated even the boldest rivals, there was another side of her. A side that few ever saw. Isabella longed for warmth. She longed for a home filled with laughter, for a man who would hold her not because of her bank account, but because of her heart. She had built towers of glass and steel, yet her soul lived in an empty room. When Richard Carter came into her life, she thought she had finally found what she was searching for. Richard was handsome, charming, and attentive in ways that disarmed her. He made her laugh, something she hadn't done in years. He opened doors for her, pulled out her chair at dinners, whispered promises of a future filled with love. Slowly, he melted the armor she had built around herself. Against all logic, Isabella allowed herself to be vulnerable. She gave him her trust, her name, and eventually her empire. The board had raised eyebrows when she married him. Some whispered that Richard was nothing more than an opportunist, a man intoxicated by her wealth and power. But Isabella silenced them with her conviction. She wanted to believe love could conquer doubt, and when she discovered she was pregnant, she believed all her sacrifices had been worth it. For the first time in her life, Isabella felt complete. She imagined a nursery painted in soft colors, lullabies echoing through the halls of her vast mansion, tiny hands clutching hers as she whispered bedtime stories. She pictured Richard by her side, proud and protective, the perfect husband and father. What she didn't know was that while she dreamed of family, Richard was plotting her downfall. But on that night, as the limousine carried her away from the gala, Isabella wasn't thinking of betrayal. She was thinking of the life inside her, the child she already loved more than her fortune. She was thinking of the happiness she thought was finally hers. And she had no idea that her fairy tale was about to turn into a nightmare. Richard Carter was everything Isabella thought she wanted in a man. Tall, confident, with a smile that could disarm anyone in the room. To the outside world, he appeared to be the perfect husband. Well-dressed, polite, always standing a step behind his powerful wife, ready to play the role of the supportive partner. People envied Isabella, thinking she had managed to find not only success in business, but also love in marriage. But Richard had mastered the art of performance. What others saw as charm was nothing more than manipulation, carefully crafted to get him closer to what he wanted most: power. Behind closed doors, Richard was a different man. He was restless, bitter, and consumed by envy. He hated being introduced as Isabella Carter's husband. Every time he saw her name on the cover of a magazine, every time he watched her command a room full of powerful investors, something dark twisted inside him. He wanted the spotlight for himself. He wanted to be the one people admired, the one people feared, the one people bowed to. The truth was, Richard had married Isabella for her empire. From the beginning, her wealth, influence, and reputation were the glittering prizes he had his eyes on. Love was just a mask he wore, a mask that Isabella desperately wanted to believe was real. And while Isabella dreamed of family, Richard sought out someone else: Melissa, a young socialite with ambition as sharp as his own. Melissa wasn't naive. She knew Richard was married, but she saw in him a ticket to the life she craved. Together they whispered plans in dimly lit hotel rooms, their laughter laced with cruelty. "You'll never be more than her shadow as long as she's alive," Melissa teased one night, her lips brushing Richard's ear. "Unless you do something about it." That seed of thought grew quickly inside him. Why should Isabella have everything? Wealth, reputation, and now even a child, while he lived as her accessory. The child in her womb only made things worse. It meant she was more powerful than ever, and he was pushed further into the background. Richard began to see Isabella not as a partner, but as an obstacle standing between him and the life he believed he deserved. He imagined the headlines after her tragic accident: "Beloved CEO gone too soon." He pictured himself stepping into her place, grieving widower turned business leader, the world's sympathy paving his way to the top. In public, Richard kissed Isabella's cheek and placed his hand on her belly as if he cared. In private, he sketched out her end like a ruthless businessman planning a deal. His eyes, once warm and adoring, now burned with calculation. To Isabella, he remained the charming husband. To Melissa, he was the man destined to inherit an empire. But to himself, Richard was already something else entirely. He was a predator circling his prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. While Isabella and Richard lived in penthouses and attended glittering galas, David Miller's life was carved out in quieter, harsher tones. A widower in his mid-30s, David had once been a respected manager at Carter Enterprises. He was known for his work ethic, his integrity, and his steady leadership. But none of that had mattered the day Isabella Carter herself had called him into her office and coldly told him he was no longer needed. It wasn't personal. To Isabella, it was just business. Numbers hadn't lined up, projections had dipped, and someone had to take the fall. David had pleaded his case, explaining the circumstances, even showing her the photo of his daughter Lily, taped inside his worn leather wallet. But Isabella, with her icy gaze and flawless composure, dismissed him in minutes. "I need results, not excuses," she had said. Those words burned into him, a scar deeper than the loss of a paycheck. After that day, David's world grew heavier. He worked whatever odd jobs he could find, from driving delivery vans to fixing cars in a friend's garage. His only constant was Lily, a bright-eyed 7-year-old who carried his late wife's smile. She was his anchor, his reason to keep moving even when the world seemed determined to grind him down. David never spoke ill of Isabella to his daughter, though. He didn't want bitterness poisoning Lily's innocence. Instead, when Lily asked why he didn't wear his suit and tie anymore, he simply told her that Daddy was trying something new. Inside, though, he wrestled with feelings of failure and humiliation. Still, David was not the kind of man to drown in self-pity. Each morning he packed Lily's lunch, braided her hair clumsily, and walked her to school before hustling to his next job. People who knew him said he carried himself with quiet dignity, the kind of strength that didn't need to shout. And yet fate has a way of weaving lives together in the most unexpected ways. On the night of Isabella's supposed accident, David was nearby, having just finished a late shift driving a temporary route. He was bone-tired, his clothes smelling faintly of gasoline, when he noticed the glow of flames ahead. At first, he thought it was a car stalled in the street, but as he drew closer, he saw the limousine engulfed in fire, and a woman trapped inside, pounding on the glass with desperate, fading strength. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think of the risks or of the woman who had once ruined his career. He only saw a human being fighting for her life. And in that split second, David made a choice. The same hands that once typed reports and signed contracts now tore furiously at the car door. The same man Isabella had dismissed without a second thought was now the one fighting against the inferno to save her. And in that moment, their fates became forever entwined. For Isabella, the news came like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She was pregnant. After years of pouring herself into contracts, mergers, and late nights in glass towers, she finally held something far more precious than money or power. She was carrying life inside her. The moment the doctor confirmed it, her eyes welled with tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years. For once, she wasn't thinking of quarterly earnings or stock prices. She was thinking of lullabies. Little shoes lined up by the door, and soft cries echoing in the halls of her mansion. She returned home glowing, clutching the sonogram photo like it was a priceless diamond. Richard was in his study, sipping whiskey, scrolling through his phone. Isabella walked in with a smile that lit up the room. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement, "we're going to have a baby." He looked up, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, he managed a smile, a weak imitation of joy. He kissed her forehead, muttered something about being happy for her, and poured another glass of whiskey. But inside, Richard's stomach twisted with rage. A baby was not part of his plan. To Isabella, the child was a blessing. To Richard, it was a chain. With a baby in the picture, Isabella's power in the company would only grow stronger. The board would adore her image as a mother and business leader. Investors would rally behind her. She would be untouchable. And Richard? He would remain the accessory, the man in her shadow. At night, Isabella caressed her belly, whispering dreams about their future family. She painted pictures of playrooms and family vacations, of Richard teaching their child to ride a bike. She believed she had finally unlocked the life she always wanted. Love, family, and success blending into a perfect whole. But when Isabella drifted to sleep, Richard sat awake, staring into the darkness. In his mind, the baby was not a gift, it was a threat. He thought of Melissa, waiting in her silk sheets, reminding him that he deserved more, that he could have it all if Isabella wasn't in the way. Her voice echoed in his head like a poison-laced lullaby. "Once she's gone," Melissa whispered in memory, "everything is yours. The money, the company, freedom, and me." Richard began to drink more heavily, each glass of whiskey fueling his resentment. He put on a performance during the day, placing his hand gently on Isabella's stomach when others were watching, smiling for the cameras. Behind the facade, he seethed with jealousy, hatred, and an obsession with control. Isabella never noticed. She was too busy dreaming of a nursery and planning names. She believed her husband was simply overwhelmed, adjusting to the idea of fatherhood. She mistook his silence for nerves, his distance for shock. What she didn't realize was that while she dreamed of rocking her baby in her arms, Richard was already imagining how to turn her joy into ashes. And soon he would take the first step toward her destruction. Melissa Sinclair had always been drawn to power. With her flawless beauty and sharp tongue, she knew how to climb social ladders, using charm as her weapon. When she first met Richard Carter at a private club, she recognized him immediately, not for his own achievements, but for the woman standing beside him. Everyone knew Isabella Carter, the untouchable CEO. Melissa saw Richard as her doorway into that world, and Richard saw Melissa as his mirror, ambitious, selfish, and hungry. Their affair began quickly, fueled by secrecy and adrenaline. In hotel suites and dimly lit bars, they laughed at Isabella behind her back. Melissa mocked her elegance, her cold demeanor, her reputation for being the perfect woman. Richard drank it in, finding comfort in Melissa's cruel validation. Together, they convinced themselves they were the real victors, while Isabella was nothing more than an obstacle to their happiness. But Melissa wanted more than stolen nights. She wanted the empire, and she pushed Richard to think bigger. "You'll never be free as long as she's alive," Melissa murmured one evening, her fingers tracing circles on Richard's chest. "Don't you see? Everything you want is locked behind her name. But accidents happen. Cars crash, fires start, people grieve and move on. And then you, my love, step forward as the grieving widower who inherits it all." The idea slithered into Richard's mind like venom. At first, he resisted, but Melissa knew exactly how to manipulate him. She whispered promises of the life they could build together. Mansions, yachts, freedom from Isabella's shadow. Slowly, Richard's hesitation crumbled, replaced by a dangerous determination. They began to plot. Richard used his connections to discreetly pay a mechanic to tamper with Isabella's limousine, making it a death trap waiting to ignite. Melissa arranged alibis, suggesting restaurants they could be seen at, parties they should attend, so no suspicion would ever fall on them. Richard rehearsed his role in front of mirrors. The devastated husband, clutching reporters' hands, tears streaming down his face. He practiced lines of grief, lines that would melt sympathy from the public and silence the boardroom doubters. Meanwhile, Isabella remained blissfully unaware. She spent her days planning the nursery, shopping for tiny clothes, and smiling at the thought of her child's future. She believed her husband's distracted behavior was just nerves about becoming a father. When Richard kissed her forehead and told her he was working late, she never questioned where he really was. The closer the plan drew to reality, the colder Richard became. His heart, once capable of pretending to love, turned entirely to stone. Melissa fanned the flames of his greed, reminding him that every second Isabella lived was another second he remained second best. Finally, the night was chosen. After the gala, Isabella would be driven home in her limousine. Richard would wave her off with a smile, knowing the car was rigged to burn. Melissa would be waiting for him, champagne chilled, ready to celebrate their future. Neither of them imagined that fate and an unexpected man would rewrite their perfect plan. The annual Carter Enterprises Gala was the event of the year. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, champagne flowed like rivers, and every powerful figure in the city was present. It was a night designed to showcase Isabella Carter's empire, her wealth, her power, her image as the unstoppable queen of business. Photographers lined the red carpet, flashes sparking like fireworks as she arrived in a flowing silver gown that shimmered with each step. Isabella carried herself with her usual grace, her hand protectively resting on her small but visible baby bump. She was radiant, glowing not just with beauty, but with the quiet joy of impending motherhood. The cameras loved her, and the guests whispered about how she seemed softer, warmer than usual. For the first time, Isabella looked like more than a businesswoman. She looked like a mother-to-be, a woman with a complete life. But while the crowd admired her, Richard's eyes burned with contempt. Every compliment directed at Isabella was a dagger in his pride. He trailed beside her, smiling on cue, his hand on the small of her back, but inside he seethed. Tonight wasn't about celebrating her success. For him, tonight was the beginning of her downfall. The humiliation began subtly. Richard introduced Isabella to a group of investors, but instead of praising her leadership, he cracked jokes at her expense. Pregnancy brain? He chuckled when she momentarily forgot a name. Laughter rippled awkwardly, and Isabella forced a polite smile, hiding the sting behind her calm exterior. Later, as they stood by the buffet, Richard made a cruel remark about how much she was eating, loud enough for others to hear. "Careful, darling," he sneered. "You'll be bigger than the company jet at this rate." Melissa, mingling nearby under the guise of a business associate, smirked behind her champagne glass. Isabella's cheeks flushed, but she swallowed her pride. She refused to let Richard's barbs ruin the evening. She told herself he was just nervous about fatherhood, that stress was making him act out. She held her head high, greeting guests, thanking donors, doing her best to maintain her flawless image. What she didn't know was that outside, in the garage beneath the glittering ballroom, her limousine was waiting like a loaded gun. The tampered engine was primed, wires twisted in ways designed to spark, gasoline ready to ignite. The car that symbolized her wealth and power was now a silent trap, set to turn her into ashes. As the night wore on, Isabella grew tired. The baby shifted inside her, and she placed a gentle hand on her stomach. "Richard," she said softly, "I'm ready to go home." Richard forced a smile, hiding the excitement that surged inside him. "Of course, darling. Let's get you comfortable." He waved for the driver, his eyes cold with anticipation. The guests waved them off, believing they were witnessing a perfect couple heading home after a successful night. Isabella, exhausted but content, settled into the limousine, unaware of the danger. Richard lingered behind, pretending to take a call, and as the car pulled away into the night, Richard knew his deadly plan was finally in motion. The limousine glided smoothly through the quiet streets, its leather seats cradling Isabella as she leaned back with a tired but satisfied sigh. The gala had drained her, but it had also filled her with hope. The smiles, the congratulations, the subtle pats on her stomach. She felt loved, admired, and secure in her role, not just as CEO but as a mother-to-be. She rested her hand on her belly and whispered, "We're going to have such a beautiful life together." For a moment, all was calm. Then came the smell. A faint, acrid sting, sharp enough to make her nose wrinkle. Gasoline. At first, Isabella thought it was nothing, perhaps just the city air or a brief glitch in the car. But the scent grew stronger, thicker, suffocating. Her heart began to race. "Driver?" she called, leaning forward. But the partition was up and there was no response. She knocked harder. "Driver?" Still nothing. A chill prickled down her spine. Suddenly, the engine roared unnaturally, the car jerking forward faster than it should. Isabella's instincts screamed at her. She reached for the door handle, locked. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She tried the other door, locked. Panic clawed at her chest. And then it happened. A violent boom erupted from the hood, fire exploding outward and racing along the sides of the car. Flames licked the tinted windows, turning the luxurious limousine into a steel coffin. Smoke poured inside, thick and black, burning her lungs with every gasp. Isabella coughed, hacking desperately as her eyes watered and her vision blurred. She screamed, slamming her fists against the glass. "Help! Somebody help me!" But the street was empty, the city eerily silent around her. Her designer gown clung to her skin, damp with sweat as the heat intensified. She clawed at the door handle, her nails breaking, her knuckles raw and bloody. Tears streamed down her face, not from the smoke, but from the terror of losing not just her life, but the precious child inside her. In that hellish moment, Isabella wasn't the powerful CEO. She wasn't the woman whose signature could move millions of dollars. She was just a mother, begging the universe to spare her baby. Her mind raced with flashes of Richard, the man she trusted, the man she believed loved her. She imagined him waiting at home, worried sick. She whispered his name, clinging to the hope that he cared. But deep down, in the pit of her soul, a darker thought began to surface. What if this wasn't an accident? The fire spread quickly, flames curling around her, searing her skin. Her lungs screamed for air. She pounded on the glass with her fists, with her heels, with every ounce of strength she had left. Her screams grew weaker, her movements slower. Just when her body was about to surrender, she saw it, a shadow through the smoke. Someone was running toward her, a figure against the backdrop of fire. Strong arms slammed against the door, pulling, kicking, refusing to give up. Through the haze, Isabella's eyes widened. She recognized that face. It was David Miller, the man she had once fired without mercy. And now he was the only person standing between her and a fiery grave. The heat was unbearable, waves of fire pulsing against the limousine as if the car itself had turned into a furnace. Isabella's strength was fading, her fists too weak to strike the glass anymore. She pressed her palm to her stomach, whispering broken pleas to her unborn child. "Please, hold on. Please." And then, bang, The car door rattled violently. Through the wall of smoke, she saw him. David Miller. His face streaked with sweat and soot, his shirt already singed by the flames, his eyes blazing with determination. David had been on his way home from a late shift when he saw the fire. He didn't think. He didn't weigh the risks. He only knew someone was inside. And when he recognized Isabella, the very woman who had once crushed his career with a single cold sentence, he didn't pause. He ran harder. "Hang on," he shouted, kicking at the door with all his strength. The metal groaned but held firm. Isabella's terrified eyes met his, silently begging him not to leave. He grabbed a shard of concrete from the street and smashed it against the window, over and over, until cracks spiderwebbed across the glass. The flames roared louder, eating away at precious seconds. Finally, the window shattered, shards exploding outward. Smoke poured out and David thrust his arm inside. "Take my hand!" Isabella coughed violently, struggling to breathe, her body trembling with exhaustion. She reached out, her fingers barely brushing his. I can't," she sobbed, too weak. "Yes, you can," David barked, his voice raw with urgency. "You're not dying here, Isabella. Not like this. Not tonight." Summoning the last of her strength, Isabella grabbed hold. David pulled with every muscle in his body, cutting his arms on the glass as he dragged her through the window. The fire singed his skin, smoke clawed at his lungs, but he refused to let go. With one final heave, Isabella collapsed into his arms, her body trembling, her gown scorched and torn. He carried her away from the inferno, stumbling onto the sidewalk just as the limousine exploded behind them in a deafening blast. The shockwave knocked them forward, flames lighting up the night sky. David shielded Isabella with his own body, protecting her from the rain of debris. Isabella clung to him, sobbing uncontrollably, her voice hoarse. "My baby, my baby." David looked into her tear-streaked face, his own chest heaving. He wanted to promise her everything would be okay, but the truth weighed heavy in his heart. Still, he tightened his arms around her and whispered, "You're alive. That's what matters right now. Stay with me." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Neighbors poured onto the streets, gasping at the sight of the burning limousine. Whispers spread quickly. "Is that Isabella Carter? The CEO?" People pointed, phones recorded, flashes of light catching Isabella's ruined gown and David's scorched clothes. But Isabella didn't hear them. She was slipping in and out of consciousness, clutching her stomach, her cries breaking David's heart. And as the ambulance screeched to a halt, neither of them knew that this rescue was only the beginning of a storm that would change their lives forever. The sterile white lights of the hospital felt colder than the flames Isabella had just escaped. Sirens faded as paramedics rushed her inside, her hands still clutching her stomach. David ran beside the stretcher, his clothes scorched, his arms bandaged hastily. He ignored his own pain, his only focus on the woman trembling in fear. "Please," Isabella whispered through cracked lips, her voice barely audible. "Save my baby, please." Doctors and nurses swarmed her, voices overlapping, machines beeping. David was pushed aside, left in the hallway with soot-stained hands and a heart pounding in helpless rhythm. He sank into a chair, staring at the swinging doors that had swallowed Isabella. For a man who had already buried a wife, the thought of another family torn apart was unbearable. Hours crawled by like years. At last, a doctor emerged, his expression solemn. David rose instantly. "How is she?" The doctor exhaled. "She's stable. She inhaled a dangerous amount of smoke, but she'll recover physically." He paused, lowering his voice. "I'm sorry. We couldn't save the baby." The word struck David like a blow. His fists clenched, his throat tightening. He knew he would have to be the one to face her with the truth. Inside the dim hospital room, Isabella lay pale and fragile, her hair damp with sweat. Her eyes fluttered open, searching for an answer in David's face. "My baby," she whispered, voice trembling with fragile hope. David's chest ached. He sat beside her, taking her trembling hand into his. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I'm so sorry, Isabella. The baby didn't make it." For a moment, silence. Then the dam inside her broke. Her cry was raw, primal, echoing off the walls. She clutched her stomach, sobbing with the kind of grief that tore through bone and soul alike. "No, no, no, that was my child, my future." David held her as she shattered, his arms strong yet gentle. He whispered the only words he could. "You're not alone. You're still here. And I'm not leaving." Tears soaked his shirt as she wept. her powerful image as CEO stripped away until only a broken mother remained. For the first time, Isabella allowed someone to see the side of her she had hidden from the world. The side that longed not for contracts or power, but for love, for family, for something real. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Richard poured champagne into Melissa's glass, celebrating as if he had already won. To him, the plan had succeeded. Isabella was as good as gone. He had no idea she had survived, no idea the empire he thought was falling into his lap was still guarded by the very woman he tried to destroy. Back in the hospital, David stayed by Isabella's side through the night, adjusting her blanket, offering water, whispering comfort whenever nightmares jolted her awake. He had once been discarded by her without mercy, but now he was the only one she had left to lean on. And in that moment of devastating loss, Isabella began to see David not as the man she fired, but as the man fate had sent to save her broken heart. While Isabella lay in a hospital bed grieving the loss of her unborn child, Richard Carter was already weaving his web of lies. To the outside world, he painted himself as the devastated husband who had narrowly avoided tragedy. To Melissa, he played the role of the confident mastermind, assuring her everything was under control. He showed up at the hospital hours after Isabella's emergency, his shirt neatly pressed, his tie perfectly knotted. He entered the room with rehearsed grief on his face, clutching a bouquet of flowers as though they could erase the flames he had set into motion. "Oh, Bella," he whispered, rushing to her bedside. "Thank God you're alive. I don't know what I would have done if I'd lost you." Isabella turned her head away, silent tears streaking down her pale cheeks. David stood in the corner of the room, his arms crossed, eyes narrowing at Richard's every word. He didn't believe a single one of them. Richard reached for Isabella's hand, but she pulled it away weakly. Her voice cracked as she asked the question burning in her soul. "Where were you, Richard? Why weren't you with me?" His answer came smoothly, without hesitation. "I got a call from a board member. An urgent matter I couldn't ignore. I thought you'd be safe in the car. I never imagined. Bella, please, you have to believe me. This was a terrible accident." His performance was flawless, his voice dripping with sorrow, his eyes glistening with fake tears. To anyone else, it might have been convincing. But to Isabella, something felt wrong. The way his hands trembled only when she looked at him. The way his gaze flickered too quickly toward David, almost as if threatened by his presence. David's jaw clenched. He had seen enough lies in his life to recognize one. He stepped forward, his tone steady but cutting. "Funny thing about accidents, Richard. They don't usually involve rigged fuel lines and faulty wires that were tampered with. Someone wanted that car to burn." Richard's mask faltered for a split second before he caught himself. He forced a hollow chuckle. "You must be mistaken. What would I gain from something like that? Isabella is my wife, the mother of my child." He stopped abruptly, realizing too late what he had said. Isabella's face twisted with pain. "Mother of your child? Richard, the baby is gone." Her voice cracked, tears spilling again. "I lost our baby in that fire. Do you even care?" Richard stumbled over his words, fumbling for sympathy. "Of course I care, I'm devastated. But we can try again, we'll rebuild, we'll—" His words rang empty, each one slicing deeper into Isabella's broken heart. She saw no grief in his eyes, only irritation that his plan hadn't worked as intended. That night, as Richard left the hospital room, David leaned closer to Isabella and whispered, "He's hiding something, and I promise you, we'll find the truth." For the first time, Isabella began to question whether the fire had truly been fate or Richard's betrayal. The morning after the fire, Carter Enterprises was buzzing with whispers. The news had already spread. Isabella Carter, the powerful CEO, had narrowly escaped death in a limousine explosion. The media called it a freak accident, but inside the company, rumors swirled like wildfire. Investors were nervous, board members unsettled, and enemies of Isabella smelled blood in the water. Richard seized the opportunity. He walked into the boardroom with his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor, his expression grave but controlled. He positioned himself as the protective husband, eager to support his wife and safeguard the company in her absence. Isabella, still weak from the hospital, insisted on attending the emergency meeting. She arrived with David at her side, his arm discreetly steadying her as she walked. The room fell silent when they entered. all eyes on the woman who had survived flames. But instead of sympathy, she felt suspicion. The board members exchanged glances, whispering behind their hands. Richard cleared his throat dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are facing a crisis. Last night, my wife nearly lost her life. And while we're grateful she survived, we must face the truth. Someone inside this company may have been negligent, or worse, malicious." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Isabella's eyes narrowed, but before she could speak, Richard continued. "I have reason to believe the incident was not random. The limousine was maintained by our own staff, and the man who interfered at the scene, who tampered with evidence before authorities arrived." He paused, letting the silence build tension. Then he pointed directly at David. "Was him." Gasps erupted. David stiffened, his fists clenching at his sides. "That's a lie," he said firmly. "I didn't tamper with anything. I pulled Isabella out of a burning car. If I hadn't been there, she would be dead right now." But Richard was prepared. He slid photos across the table, images of David at the scene, his hands on the car, his clothes scorched. These were taken by bystanders. To an untrained eye, it looks like heroism. But what if he staged it? What if he sabotaged the car, then swooped in as the savior to cover his tracks? The room erupted in nervous murmurs. Isabella's face went pale. She opened her mouth to defend David, but Richard cut in quickly. "Bella, I know you want to believe the best in people, but this man has every reason to hate you. You fired him. You humiliated him. Perhaps this was his revenge." David's voice cracked with restrained fury. "I don't care what you say about me, but don't twist the truth. I risked my life to save hers." He looked directly at Isabella, his eyes pleading. "You know that." But the board wasn't interested in truth. They wanted stability. Fear clouded their judgment. By the end of the meeting, a motion was passed. David was to be dismissed immediately, banned from the company premises. As security escorted him out, Isabella's heart wrenched. She wanted to stop them, to reveal her suspicions about Richard, but she was too weak, too cornered. And as David's figure disappeared from the glass doors, Isabella realized she had lost the only man she could truly trust. Isabella Carter had built her empire on discipline and strategy, but in the weeks after the fire, her heart was heavy, her body weakened by grief. She should have been resting, healing from the loss of her child. Instead, she forced herself into a new mission: finding out the truth. The board may have turned against David, but Isabella's instincts told her Richard was hiding something. His performance at the hospital, his crocodile tears, his eagerness to shift blame. All of it gnawed at her. She knew power games when she saw them, and her own husband was playing one inside her home. So she did what any CEO would do. She launched an investigation, quietly, secretly. Isabella contacted a trusted security consultant, one who owed her favors from past deals. "I need surveillance," she instructed. "Follow Richard, discreetly. Track his meetings, his phone calls, his accounts. Leave nothing unchecked." Days turned into nights, and Isabella buried herself in the evidence. She pored over bank statements, late-night credit card charges, strange transfers that had nothing to do with company business. Patterns began to emerge, pointing to hotels, jewelry purchases, and dinners for two. The puzzle slowly built itself, piece by damning piece. One evening, the consultant placed a file on her desk. "You need to see this," he said gravely. Isabella opened it with trembling hands. Inside were photographs, grainy but clear enough. Richard, her husband, kissing a younger woman in the lobby of an upscale hotel. Richard holding her waist, his hand far too familiar. Richard laughing with her in a way Isabella hadn't seen in years. Her breath caught in her throat. The woman was Melissa Sinclair, a name she recognized from society events, a woman known for her beauty and ruthless ambition. Isabella's stomach churned as realization struck. Richard hadn't just betrayed her heart, he had conspired with Melissa to destroy her. She closed the file slowly, her hands shaking. The memory of the flames, the sound of the explosion, the pain of losing her baby, all of it rushed back with brutal clarity. Richard hadn't just been careless, he had tried to kill her. That night, Isabella sat alone in her study, staring at the city lights through glass windows. Tears streamed silently down her face, but her eyes burned with a new fire. For too long she had been blind, softened by love, weakened by hope. No more. She had lost her child, but she would not lose herself. Her phone buzzed. A message from the consultant. There's more. You'll want to see it in person. Isabella wiped her tears, her resolve hardening. She wasn't the broken woman Richard thought he had left in the hospital bed. She was still Isabella Carter, the CEO, the survivor, the woman who had built an empire from nothing. And now, she was preparing to take back her life. Richard had written her obituary too soon. She was alive, and soon the world would know the truth. The night Isabella discovered Richard's affair, she felt both shattered and sharpened. Betrayal had carved wounds into her heart, but beneath the pain, a colder, stronger resolve was forming. She knew she couldn't fight this battle alone. Richard had charm, influence, and the board under his thumb. She needed someone who understood loyalty, someone who had already proven his courage when no one else would. Her thoughts turned to David Miller. It had been weeks since the board forced him out, humiliated him once again. Isabella had tried to reach out, but David hadn't answered. He had every reason to hate her, for firing him once, for letting Richard frame him again. Yet she couldn't shake the memory of his arms pulling her from the fire, of his quiet strength in the hospital when she thought her world had ended. One evening, Isabella swallowed her pride and drove herself to a modest neighborhood on the edge of the city. The house was small, its paint chipped, the yard littered with Lily's toys. She hesitated at the door before knocking. David answered, his face hardening the moment he saw her. "Why are you here?" His tone was sharp, protective. Behind him, little Lily peeked out, her innocent eyes widening at the sight of the glamorous woman who had once destroyed her father's career. "I need your help," Isabella said simply. Her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of humility. "Richard, he's not just unfaithful. He tried to kill me, and I can't prove it without you." David's jaw tightened. For a long moment silence filled the doorway. Then he stepped aside, letting her in. Over steaming cups of coffee at his worn kitchen table, Isabella laid everything out, the affair, the financial records, the photographs of Richard and Melissa. Her hands shook as she spoke, but her voice remained steady. David listened, his expression unreadable, his daughter quietly coloring in the corner. When Isabella finished, David leaned back, crossing his arms. "You're asking a lot, Isabella. You fired me, twice. You let Richard turn everyone against me. Why should I believe you now?" Her eyes welled with tears. "Because you were the only one who didn't let me die. Because I have no one else I can trust." Something in her words broke through his defenses. David had built walls around his heart after so much loss, but he couldn't ignore the truth in her voice. He had seen the fire in her eyes before, the fire of a woman who refused to surrender. Now that fire was tempered by pain, and it stirred something in him, compassion, maybe even admiration. At last he nodded slowly. "All right, but if we do this, we do it my way. Quiet, careful. No boardroom theatrics until we have undeniable proof." Relief washed over Isabella as she exhaled. For the first time since the fire, she felt the faint flicker of hope. Together, they began outlining a plan. Surveillance, financial tracking, gathering witnesses. Piece by piece, they would dismantle Richard's empire of lies. And side by side, Isabella and David were about to wage a war that Richard never saw coming. While Isabella and David quietly pieced together evidence, Richard was busy building castles in the air with Melissa Sinclair. To him, the failed assassination was only a temporary setback. Isabella might have survived, but in his mind, it was only a matter of time before he took everything that should have been his. Melissa draped across a velvet sofa in her penthouse, sipping champagne as she flipped through fashion magazines. "You worry too much," she purred, glancing at Richard over the rim of her glass. "The board already trusts you more than her. You just have to keep the pressure on. She's weak now, grieving. This is the perfect moment to strike." Richard paced the room, his jaw tight. "I wanted her gone, Melissa, permanently. Instead, she's clinging to life like some stubborn weed. And that fire, people still talk about it. I need her out of the way, where the empire doesn't move to me." Melissa smirked, tossing her magazine aside. "Then make her look incompetent. Let her spiral. You know how people love to tear down a fallen queen, and when she collapses, you'll be there to take her throne." Richard paused, considering her words. His mind raced with possibilities. If Isabella appeared unstable, distracted, the board would side with him. He began to imagine press releases with his name, magazine covers showing him as the grieving widower turned visionary leader. He would finally be free of her shadow. But Melissa wasn't done. She leaned forward, her voice low and persuasive. "And when you're officially in charge, you and I will be unstoppable. No more hiding in hotel rooms. No more secrets. We'll have everything. Her company, her fortune, her power. She'll be nothing but a sad story." Richard's lips curved into a smile. "And her so-called hero, David Miller? He's already gone. The board doesn't trust him. He's finished." Melissa laughed softly, clinking her glass against his. "Perfect. Then it's only a matter of time. Soon, Richard, it will all be ours." They toasted to a future built on betrayal, blind to the storm brewing against them. Back at the company, Richard began executing his plan. He planted whispers among board members, hinting that Isabella was too emotional to lead after her tragic loss. He exaggerated her absences from meetings, spun her grief into weakness, painted her as a liability. Slowly, he poisoned the well, turning colleagues into doubters. Meanwhile, Melissa flaunted their relationship in subtle ways, showing up at exclusive events on Richard's arm, pretending to be a consultant, while letting speculation swirl. The tabloids began to buzz, but Richard brushed it off, confident that the world was buying his performance as the steady, grieving husband. In private, he and Melissa laughed at Isabella's supposed downfall. They believed they had already won. But what Richard didn't know was that Isabella and David were already watching, already gathering every piece of evidence that would one day tear his world apart. Evelyn Price was no stranger to the brutal games of corporate power. As CEO of a rival firm and one of the sharpest minds in the financial world, she had sparred with Isabella for years. Their relationship had always been a tense balance, sometimes competitors, sometimes allies, but always with mutual respect. Evelyn admired Isabella's discipline, even if she never admitted it publicly. When news broke of Isabella's accident, Evelyn raised an eyebrow. She had seen too many powerful women conveniently silenced, too many tragedies that benefited the men standing in the shadows. She didn't believe in coincidences, and Richard Carter's sudden attempts to step into the spotlight reeked of something rotten. At a charity luncheon weeks later, Evelyn encountered Richard. He approached her with the slick smile of a salesman, his hand outstretched, his tone dripping with false charm. "Evelyn," he greeted warmly, "it's been too long. Isabella is still recovering, so I'm stepping up to make sure the company stays strong. Perhaps we could discuss a partnership over dinner?" Evelyn studied him like a hawk sizing up prey. His eyes were too eager, his words rehearsed. She had seen his type before, men who craved power but lacked the backbone to build it themselves. She offered him a polite smile, but inside alarms blared. Later that evening, Evelyn made a quiet phone call. "Isabella," she said when the line connected. "It's Evelyn Price, we need to talk." Isabella was surprised. Evelyn was not someone who reached out casually. "Why?" she asked cautiously. "Because your husband is circling like a vulture," Evelyn replied bluntly. "And I don't think his concern for you is genuine. I've been in this game long enough to smell a setup. Whatever he's planning, you can count me in to expose him." For the first time in weeks, Isabella felt a flicker of strength she hadn't realized she needed. She agreed to meet Evelyn in secret, away from Richard's eyes. Over glasses of wine in a quiet corner of an upscale restaurant, Evelyn laid her cards on the table. Men like Richard never think ahead. They're sloppy. They leave trails. If you and I work together, we'll find them. And when we do, I'll make sure the board has no choice but to listen. Isabella listened, her heart swelling with cautious hope. Evelyn wasn't a friend, not exactly, but she was a woman who understood the cost of survival in a man's world. She was powerful, strategic, and ruthless when she needed to be, the perfect ally. Meanwhile, Richard grew bolder. He strutted into board meetings with Melissa on his arm, claiming she was a consultant hired to advise him. The board shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. He believed he had silenced all opposition. What he didn't know was that two of the sharpest women in the corporate world, Isabella and Evelyn, were quietly aligning against him. And when their trap finally snapped shut, Richard's empire of lies would come crashing down. The grand hall of the annual corporate summit shimmered with gold chandeliers and echoed with the hum of powerful voices. Executives, investors, and journalists crowded into the space, eager to witness the event that shaped the financial world each year. Richard Carter walked onto the stage in a tailored suit, Melissa at his side, her smile smug and victorious. To the audience, it looked like Richard had stepped into his wife's shoes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his tone solemn, "I stand before you during a difficult time. My wife, Isabella, is still recovering from her tragic accident, but rest assured, Carter Enterprises remains strong under my leadership." Polite applause followed, though some faces in the crowd looked uncertain. Rumors had spread, whispers about Richard's growing arrogance and Melissa's suspicious presence. Still, Richard believed he had won. He carried himself like a king, claiming his crown. But just as he began to outline his so-called vision for the company's future, the doors at the back of the hall opened. Silence rippled through the room as Isabella Carter entered, dressed in a striking black suit that radiated authority. Every step she took echoed like a drumbeat of defiance. David walked behind her, carrying a thick folder of documents, and Evelyn trailed with a confident smirk. Richard's face drained of color. He hadn't expected her to show. Isabella walked straight to the stage, her gaze locked on her husband. "Step aside, Richard," she said, her voice steady, powerful. "This is my company, and tonight the truth comes out." The audience leaned forward, captivated. Journalists raised their cameras. Board members exchanged nervous glances. Richard forced a laugh, though his voice trembled. "Bella, darling, you shouldn't be here. You're not well." "I am well enough to expose you." Isabella cut him off, her eyes flashing. She turned to the crowd, holding up the folder. "For weeks, you've all heard whispers. Tonight, you'll hear the truth. This man, my husband, the man who vowed to protect me, conspired with his mistress to kill me." Gasps erupted. Cameras flashed wildly. Melissa shifted uncomfortably, her composure cracking. Isabella continued, her voice sharp and clear. "Here are the financial records, proof of secret transfers to mechanics who tampered with my limousine. Here are surveillance photos of Richard and Melissa together, plotting my downfall. And here," she held up a USB drive, "are recorded calls between them, where they laugh about my death." The hall exploded with shock. Richard's mask shattered as board members surged to their feet, demanding explanations. Melissa's face turned pale, her hand trembling as she tried to grab Richard's arm. "This is outrageous," Richard shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the murmurs of betrayal and disgust. Isabella's presence was unshakable, her tone fierce. "You tried to take my life. You succeeded in taking my child. But you will not take my company, and you will not escape justice." David stepped forward, placing the folder onto the table before the board. Evelyn nodded firmly. The evidence was undeniable, and in that charged silence, Richard realized his empire of lies was crumbling in front of everyone he sought to rule. The grand hall erupted into chaos after Isabella's revelation. Board members shouted across the table, investors demanded answers, and journalists swarmed forward, their cameras flashing like lightning. Richard stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, while Melissa clung to his arm, her composure cracking under the weight of the evidence. "Lies," Richard roared, slamming his fist against the podium. "All lies. My wife has lost her mind. She's grieving, unstable. How can you trust a woman who just lost her child?" But his words backfired. Gasps of horror spread across the room, and Isabella's face twisted with grief. David stepped forward, his voice steady and loud enough for all to hear. "She lost her child because of you. Because of your greed, and the proof is right here." Evelyn added, "The board will not tolerate a murderer, Richard. You're finished." Richard's eyes darted wildly, searching for support, but found only disgust. The board members he had courted turned their backs. Investors whispered of scandal and lawsuits. The once admiring audience now looked at him like a predator exposed in daylight. Then Melissa, sensing the walls closing in, stepped back. Her grip on Richard's arm loosened. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They have everything. We can't win this." Richard glared at her, panic bubbling. "Don't you dare leave me. You're in this as much as I am." But Melissa's survival instincts were sharper than her loyalty. She raised her hands, her voice cutting through the noise. "I had no part in the fire. It was all Richard's idea. He paid the mechanic. He planned everything. I was manipulated." The room gasped again, turning their full fury on Richard. His face flushed red with rage. "You lying snake!" he shouted, lunging toward her. But security moved quickly, restraining him before he could touch her. Melissa backed away, crocodile tears streaming down her face as she played the victim. I was foolish. I thought he loved me, but he's nothing but a monster. Isabella stood tall, her voice commanding the silence once more. You chose him, Melissa. You laughed while he plotted my death. But you're right about one thing. He is a monster. And tonight, the monster faces justice. At that moment, police officers entered the hall, their uniforms stark against the glittering backdrop of wealth and power. The lead detective stepped forward. Richard Carter, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted homicide, and corporate fraud. The clink of handcuffs echoed louder than any gavel. Richard thrashed against the officers, shouting curses at Isabella, at Melissa, at anyone within earshot. This isn't over. You think you've beaten me, Bella? You'll regret this. But his words were drowned out by the cheers of reporters, the murmurs of board members relieved to see justice served. Melissa, meanwhile, slipped quietly out the back door, her tears drying quickly. She had betrayed Richard to save herself. But deep down, she knew her own reckoning would come. And as Richard was dragged out of the hall in handcuffs, Isabella finally saw the empire he tried to steal collapse around him, leaving him with nothing but disgrace. The weeks after Richard's arrest were a blur of court hearings, media frenzy, and boardroom battles. Yet, for the first time in months, Isabella felt a strange kind of peace settling over her life. The storm had finally broken, and though she carried scars, both physical and emotional, she was still standing. She was alive. David was there through every step. When journalists swarmed her mansion gates, he shielded her. When the nightmares woke her in the dead of night, he sat by her bed, whispering words of comfort until she could breathe again. When grief threatened to drown her, he reminded her that survival itself was victory. One evening, Isabella invited him and his daughter Lily to dinner at her estate. The mansion, once cold and sterile, filled with laughter as Lily's giggles echoed through the grand hall. The little girl twirled in her socks across marble floors, her drawings scattered on tables that once only held contracts and reports. Isabella found herself smiling genuinely for the first time in years. After dinner, Isabella and David stepped onto the balcony, the city lights glittering below them. A soft breeze carried the scent of jasmine from her garden. For a long moment they stood in silence, the unspoken weight of everything they had endured lingering between them. Finally, Isabella turned to him. Her voice was soft, almost uncertain. David, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life, not once, but countless times since that night. I don't know where I'd be without you. David looked at her, his eyes steady and warm. You don't need to thank me. I did what anyone with a conscience would do. But Isabella, you're stronger than you realize. You didn't just survive Richard. You stood up to him. You took back your life. That's something no one can take from you. Her eyes welled with tears, not of sorrow, but of something new, hope. She reached for his hand, hesitating for just a second before intertwining her fingers with his. I used to think power and success were enough, she admitted. But they're not. I've never felt as safe or as seen as I do when I'm with you. David's hand tightened around hers, his voice low and sincere. And I've never met anyone as brave as you, Isabella. You may have fired me once, but fate gave me the chance to be here when it mattered most. I don't want to waste that chance. Their eyes locked. And for the first time, Isabella allowed herself to lean in, not as a CEO, not as a survivor, but as a woman longing for love. Their lips met in a gentle kiss, a promise of healing and new beginnings. Inside the mansion, Lily's laughter carried through the halls, a reminder that family wasn't measured in bloodlines or fortune, but in love and loyalty. And on that balcony, under the glow of city lights, Isabella realized she had finally found the home she had always dreamed of. Not in walls of glass and steel, but in the arms of the man who had saved her heart. The courthouse was packed the day Richard Carter was sentenced. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the world watched as the once charming husband was declared guilty of conspiracy, attempted murder, and fraud. His face was twisted with rage as the gavel struck, sentencing him to decades behind bars. Melissa, the mistress who betrayed him to save herself, had vanished from high society, her name whispered with disdain at every party she once craved to attend. For Isabella, justice had finally been served. But more than revenge, what she felt was release. A heavy chain broken, a door to a new future wide open. She walked out of the courthouse hand in hand with David, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a queen fighting to defend her throne. She felt like a woman who had finally found peace. Months later, the world saw a different side of Isabella Carter. No longer just the ruthless CEO, she appeared at charity events with David and Lily, smiling with warmth that was genuine, not staged for cameras. Her mansion became a home filled with life, where Lily's drawings decorated the walls and laughter replaced the echoes of silence. And then came the news that made her heart leap with both fear and joy. Isabella was pregnant again. When she showed David the test, her hands shook, but his embrace was steady, his voice firm. "This time," he whispered, "we'll face it together." The months that followed were filled with hope and healing. David attended every doctor's appointment, held her hand during sleepless nights, and reminded her with each passing day that she was never alone. Isabella, once defined by her empire, began to redefine herself as a partner, a mother, and a woman who could balance power with love. Their wedding was small but beautiful. In the garden of her estate, beneath strings of golden lights and surrounded by close friends, Isabella walked down the aisle in a simple ivory gown. David stood waiting with Lily by his side, the little girl holding a bouquet and beaming with pride. When Isabella reached them, Lily slipped her hand into hers and whispered, "Now we're really a family." Tears blurred Isabella's vision as she nodded, kissing the girl's forehead before saying her vows. The ceremony was not about grandeur, but about truth. Isabella promised to cherish the man who had saved her not just from fire, but from despair. David vowed to protect her not because of her wealth, but because he loved her heart. When they kissed, applause erupted, but all Isabella heard was the beating of her own heart, steady and full of joy. Months later, Isabella gave birth to a healthy baby boy. David held their son in his arms, Lily leaning against Isabella's side, whispering promises to be the best big sister. The house overflowed with love, something no amount of money could ever buy. And so, from ashes and betrayal, Isabella Carter rose not only as a survivor, but as a woman reborn, finding happiness, love, and the family she had always longed for. So here we are, my dear friends, at the end of Isabella's story. If you're still with me right now, it means something in this journey touched your heart in a real way. And maybe that's because her story isn't just about wealth, betrayal, or revenge. It's about something deeper. It's about resilience, about love born from ashes, and about finding peace when life tries to break you. The Stoic philosopher Seneca once said, "Difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body." Isabella's pain was unbearable, losing her child, being betrayed by the man she trusted most. But instead of letting it destroy her, she chose to rise again, to love again, and to rebuild her life on stronger foundations. That is something each of us can take to heart. No matter what storms we face, the power to rise again is always within us. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Isabella could not control Richard's cruelty, but she could control how she responded. And in choosing not to let bitterness consume her, she found healing. In life, we too will encounter betrayal, heartbreak, or moments that feel impossible to survive. But like Isabella, we can choose to stand tall, to let the pain shape us instead of shatter us. So my wonderful friends, if you're here with me now, maybe this story reminded you of your own battles, your own scars. I want you to remember, you are not defined by what breaks you, but by how you rebuild after. Love, loyalty, and inner strength are the real treasures in this life. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something deep inside, please like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement today, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's keep telling stories that remind us of the strength and beauty hidden in the human heart.